Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel, and if you're new, welcome. My name is Adelina and I make videos about living in my tiny house on wheels and living a more intentional life. As promised, today I'm going to talk about finding parking for your tiny house. I'm going to go over just some definitions and some considerations. I'm going to tell you what I did to give myself the most options possible for finding parking for my tiny house, both now and in the future. I hope it'll help. If you're interested in that, stay watching. First, let's talk about what is a tiny house. If you are looking for a definition of a tiny house, you're probably going to be frustrated because there is no one standard definition for a tiny house. A tiny house in general is identified as a house that's under 400 square feet. Now, some people will say that it's something that's under 500 square feet. But from all the research that I've done, it seems to be generally agreed upon that a tiny house is something that is under 400 square feet total living space. And also, it's important to know that a tiny house doesn't necessarily have to be on wheels. There are tiny houses on wheels. There are tiny houses that are on foundations. So the wheels part is not necessarily part of the tiny house definition, but it has a big impact on how you're going to find parking and where you're going to find parking. So let's go over that. So before we go any further, I just want to preface everything by saying that what worked for me may not work for you. What worked for me in this province that I'm in right now, Alberta, might not have worked for me in a different province in Canada. So it's important to keep that in mind. Also, a lot of you are going to want me to give you a very specific list of things that will allow you to find parking no matter where you are. I can't do that because while tiny houses are becoming much more popular all around the world, in North America, obviously, but they are not still mainstream, and the majority of places still do not have building codes and bylaws that regulate them. I wanted to say that up front so that we can get that out of the way. Another point that I want to make is that finding parking for your tiny house on wheels, we're going to talk primarily about tiny houses on wheels, but finding parking for your tiny house on wheels is not the same as being able to live in your tiny house on wheels permanently as your full-time residence. Again, big difference. And it's all due to zoning and bylaws depending on where you park. The thing is that every country has different rules. Every province has different rules. Every state has different rules. And even in each province or state, each municipality will have different rules. And so that is going to make things so much more complicated because each of those areas are going to have their own unique set of laws and rules that you will have to work around when you're trying to find parking for your tiny house on wheels. And it certainly was in my case. So the first thing you need to do is decide, where would you like to park your tiny house on wheels? Because I think that that's really important. Once you've got that in your mind, then you can start to drill down and find ways to build your tiny house that will give you the most options when you do come to park it. Also, keep in mind other considerations like, will the tiny house on wheels be the main residence on the property, or is it going to be a secondary residence? Because I have noticed that a lot of municipalities that will allow them won't allow them as the primary residence on a property. They'll allow them as a secondary residence, a laneway house, a secondary suite here in Calgary. That's what they call them. So they will allow these smaller homes built to smaller size than standard building structures, but they won't allow them as the primary residence on a piece of property, only as a secondary residence or a laneway home. So keep that in mind if you have a very specific place that you want to park your tiny house. Another important thing to note is that most municipalities, towns, cities will have minimum building sizes. And if they don't already have on their bylaws specific rules, a specific set of guidelines for houses that are smaller than standard size, then you're going to have a real hard time being able to live full-time in a home, whether it's on a foundation or on a trailer that is smaller than that. So that's important, because obviously 400 square feet, even 500 square feet is going to be far under the standard minimum building size requirements. And then they also have rules about how big a bedroom has to be, how many windows you have to have, the height of the ceiling. So if you have a loft and that is your primary bedroom, that could be an issue. I knew I was going to be in Calgary for at least a year, probably a couple. So I knew that I had to deal with a large city's bylaws and rules. And then I eventually want to be able to move it to British Columbia and onto Vancouver Island, ideally. And they are a lot less strict. They're a lot more tiny house friendly. So I knew that I was going to build for the area that was going to have the toughest regulations, because moving somewhere where they were laxer was going to be easy, but you can't go reverse. So keep that in mind. I recommend that you have some idea of where you want to park and then do the research about what is allowed there, keeping in mind that there are going to be existing bylaws and building codes. And if you're lucky, they've already dealt with tiny houses on wheels specifically. You're not having to sort of try and figure it out from scratch. But if they haven't, that could be a little tricky. It's not impossible, but it requires, like with everything else that I talk about, it requires you to do your research and be willing to be flexible, because the more flexible you are in how you're building, the more options you'll have in finding a parking spot, and also being able to live in your tiny house on wheels permanently as your main home once you're done. Keep in mind also that even municipalities, cities, towns, states, who do allow homes that are smaller than conventional building requirements, and that are secondary units, secondary homes on a property, will often have an issue with it on a trailer, with it on wheels. And I had it explained to me once in a way that I think makes a lot of sense and might help you understand why municipalities have issues with this. When you build a house on a piece of land, on a foundation, the city's going to charge you property taxes, right? And you're going to be hooked up to utilities, and those utility companies are going to be collecting revenue from you being there. And if it's on a foundation, it ain't going anywhere. But a tiny house on wheels can pick up and move. So one of the things that seems to be in the back of these officials' minds is that how can we tax and generate revenue from a house that can pick up and drive away. So that's why even places that do allow tiny houses, smaller houses, will insist that they be on a permanent foundation. And if you are not somebody who wants to build that way, then that could be an issue. There are some ways around it, which I found, but here in Calgary, that's the case. There are other tiny houses, but they are on foundations because the city requires it. The tiny house you want to build is something that you want to be 100% off-grid. That may also limit your parking options, because I know here in Calgary, one of the requirements is that you be hooked up to city utilities. If you spend the money on a beautiful solar system to be off-grid, you can use it here in the city, but you still have to be hooked up to the city power grid. So you're still going to be paying all of the fees, the connection fees and delivery charges that are associated with that. You also have to be hooked up to the gas and the sewer. So that is something to keep in mind. So of course that means that I couldn't have a compost toilet. I have to be hooked up to the sewer system here. One of the things that you can often do is have your tiny house on wheels on a piece of land that you own, because usually the rules are quite a bit less strict in that situation. However, still, very often that house, that tiny house that you've built, cannot be the primary residence on that property. There has to be another residence there. So an old farmhouse, even a mobile home that was there originally, that will count in general. But you can't buy a piece of raw land and then move your tiny house there and call it your primary residence and live in it full time, because most counties, provinces, counties here in Canada at least, will not allow the tiny house to be the only structure, the only residence on that property. It can be a secondary residence, but not the primary residence. So again, keep that in mind. Specific to tiny houses on wheels, one of the things that I mentioned earlier was that most regulators have an issue with the fact that the residence is on wheels. They need to wrap their brain around that. So that trailer will have to be registered as something. It can either be registered as an RV, a recreational vehicle, a mobile home, a trailer, or a park model, which is like a mobile home but smaller. They can have permanent wheels attached. Most mobile homes do not have permanent wheels attached to the structure. One just actually got moved into the park here a couple weeks ago, so I got to see how it actually came in. And it came in on the back of a flatbed. And then it was lifted up off of that and then blocked up. It isn't actually on a trailer. It's mobile in that it can be picked up and moved, but it's not on a permanent trailer with wheels. And that's different than a park model, which does have the wheels attached to it, but is not meant to be moved around. It's meant to be just delivered and maybe moved to the next location. But an RV is meant to be moved around. So it's on a trailer where the wheels and the axles are permanently attached, and it's meant to actually move on a regular basis from one location to another. So 3 different options. It's really important to think about how you're going to register your trailer, because that will dictate where you'll be able to park. No matter what your trailer is registered as, it will have to be built to CSA standards. Canadian Standards Association is what CSA stands for. And that means that it is being built to a specific set of building codes, and it is being inspected by the appropriate inspection agency along the way. Therefore, it's safe. It's really important to keep in mind that these things are in place because, like with any building codes, they are there to make sure that the structures are safe and that the occupants who live in them will be safe. Your trailer is going to need to have the CSA sticker on it in order for you to be able to live in it full time. So keep that in mind. When I started my build, it was my understanding, and I believe I was accurate at the time, that you could not live in an RV year-round in Alberta. There are year-round RV parks, but at the time, you could not live in them permanently. There was a limit to how many days in the year you could live in your RV. I think the highest I saw was 180 days. And so there were, like I say, specific year-round RV parks, but they weren't necessarily going to be the answer because you couldn't live in your RV year-round. I have since seen some RV parks that are year-round and do allow permanent living. Now, I'm in a mobile home park. And the thing about a mobile home park is that it's in an area that is zoned for mobile homes. That would mean that your standard mobile home and the park models would qualify. So I registered my trailer as a park model for that reason. Now, there's not a lot of mobile home parks left in Calgary and in a lot of places, because the land is so valuable that builders are always buying it up and then wanting to develop it. But a mobile home park can actually be a very good option for people who want to live in their tiny houses on wheels. However, you're still dealing with a house that's smaller than standard codes, and that could be where it gets a little iffy. So you really do want to do your research on the specific mobile home park. And I'll talk a little bit more about mine in just a little bit. So the park model is the option that I chose for that reason, because it is allowed in some mobile home parks, not all though, and it was still mobile. I didn't want a mobile home where I couldn't actually hook it up to a truck and move it if I wanted to. She's big and she's heavy, but she is still mobile. And an RV, again, would not have been the right choice for me, because I would not have been able to park in Calgary. And in Alberta, my understanding was at the time, there were no places where I could live in an RV year round. Other provinces you can. British Columbia, you can, but not in Alberta. So again, I did my research and I knew that I had to choose that for my trailer's registration. So we've been talking about tiny houses on wheels. Again, there are other options for tiny houses. There are shipping container houses that aren't on wheels, that just get put on a trailer, a flatbed to move. And there are actually a lot of other tiny houses that are built on permanent foundations. One of the things that you might want to consider is, do you need to move your house on a regular basis, or would building a tiny house that wasn't on a permanent trailer be a better option for you, because it might give you more choices when it comes to parking? Because again, like I said, Calgary does allow, they do have special considerations for tiny houses that are under the standard building codes for residential building, but they have to be on a foundation. I've seen some places where they will allow, Ontario does this, I think British Columbia does this, they may actually allow this in Alberta as well, and they may allow it in your country or your state, where you can build your house basically on a skid, I guess, and then you can set it on a foundation and have it bolt down, but it can be removed and then put back on the trailer and shipped, driven to the next location when you want to move it. So if you're not going to move your tiny house very often, that could actually give you more options for places to park, because the house is not on permanent wheels. And again, it seems to be that the wheels part that most places have an issue with. But even so, it won't matter whether your house is on a permanent trailer or it's on it's something that you just put on a flatbed to move. It's still going to need to be built to some sort of code in order to find a legal parking spot in an area that is at all regulated. So there are going to be permits required, and it's going to need to be built by a builder that is CSA certified in Canada here. And that will apply to pretty much anywhere that you're going to be building that has any kind of a building code. There's going to be something that they will require for your tiny house in order for it to be legal for you to live in full time. A lot of people who build tiny houses are the kind of people that want to do the building themselves. And I totally get that. I have no skills, but I would have loved to have been involved in the build of my tiny house. I knew that if I wanted options to park in a municipality like Calgary, that my builder needed to have CSA certification. I believe there's also an RVIA certification that applies to RVs. And it was important because that would allow the authorities to know that my builder was building to building and fire safety codes, that the home was being inspected at each stage by a qualified inspection agency, and that it would be safe. And then I could have a much higher chance of being able to live in my tiny house permanently year-round in Alberta. Keep in mind that you're going to need plans that are stamped by either an engineer or an architect in order to get your build to be CSA certified. So even if you're designing it yourself, you're going to want to be sure to have that done. And it's one of the things that was required for me, that I had to show the park here. So what did I do? Well, again, I knew that I wanted to be able to move my tiny house, so it had to be on a trailer. I understood that I could not live in an RV year-round in Alberta, and I was going to start my tiny house journey here in Alberta. So I couldn't register the trailer as an RV, which obviously left the park model option, which is what I did. I knew that I wanted to be able to park in a municipality, and I knew that choosing a builder that had the CSA certification would give me the most options to find legal, permanent, long-term parking for me and my tiny house. I did visit a builder in Nelson, British Columbia that I loved, Nelson Tiny Homes. I went out there, I met Seth, the owner, and I saw some of their builds, and they were beautiful. But they're not CSA certified. And in British Columbia, apparently it's not as big a deal because they're a lot more tiny house friendly. But I knew that that wasn't going to work for me because I had to have that certification in order to be able to park in Alberta, where I was going to start. And who knows where I'm going to move it next, right? I could end up in Ontario, the Maritimes, somewhere in the US. And if I don't have proof that my home was built by a professional who was building to a building and safety code, and that my house was inspected along the way and passed those inspections, I'm going to have a heck of a time finding parking potentially down the road. So that was very much in my mind. I had originally thought that it would be great to have definitely a compost toilet. I wanted a compost toilet because I just thought that it would give me more options as far as where geographically, physically, I could park in the woods somewhere down the road, or maybe someplace in the mountains. But parking in a municipality, you're not going to be able to have a compost toilet. There might be some places in the world, and if you're lucky enough to live in one of those places, that's awesome. But here in Canada, not going to happen. I knew that, but I didn't know what down the road would look like. So I was going to run the plumbing for a sewer, just have it capped off and have the compost toilet on top of it. But when I found the parking spot here in the city, I just went directly to a flush toilet. I never even mentioned the word compost toilet because I didn't want to freak out anybody who was making a decision about whether or not I'd be able to park here. Even if you're like set on having a compost toilet, if there's any possibility that you might be moving to a place, a city, a town that requires, that doesn't allow compost toilets, run your plumbing when you're doing your build, even if you don't need it. And also keep in mind that if you plan on ever selling your house, it will make a difference if it has the plumbing run for a sewer versus just having a compost. That's why I always intended to run that plumbing, and then I could decide on what I actually sat on top of that down the road. So the park required that the builder be CSA certified, and the park required that the trailer not be registered as an RV. So those were two things that allowed them to accept me here. Also, again, I had to be hooked up to city utilities, and that included the sewer. So it was a good thing that I had the plumbing all run. And I hadn't even purchased the compost toilet, so we just went with the flush toilet. Another thing that I realized after I'd found the spot, but before the house was finished, thank goodness, was that they did not allow propane appliances inside the units. And my furnace, my stove, and my on-demand hot water heater were all propane. It wasn't a problem for my furnace or my stove because we could switch it to natural gas, which was what the city utility is, by just changing the fitting on the end of the hose. I couldn't do that with the on-demand hot water heater, and I ended up with a hot water tank, a 60-gallon hot water tank. But That's another thing to keep in mind. What kind of appliances can you have inside the house that will be considered legal or to code wherever you're planning on parking? One of the things I really thought would be really cool when I was building my tiny house was to use some reclaimed materials. Specifically, I had seen this really beautiful old wooden door that I thought would be really cool to incorporate in my tiny house. But because you're building to code, I could not do that. So if you're building your tiny house yourself, keep in mind that the materials that you use will impact your parking options. I know that sounds weird. I actually have talked to a couple people who have built their houses themselves and are having a heck of a time finding parking here in Canada because they used reclaimed materials. They used reclaimed windows, doors, and even used trailers. And the problem is they don't meet code. And if they don't meet code, you can't live in it full time in Canada. It doesn't matter where you are. The building codes still require it to be safe, and that means that this door here, my outside door, has to be a fire door. I'm not sure of the right term, fire resistant, fireproof, whatever. It's a metal door, and that the windows had to be new. There had to be egress windows, one in the bedroom and one up in the loft for code, because it was inspected, because it was built to code. That I knew that would allow me to find more options for parking, because I could prove that. When I came to the park managers here and talked to them about parking here, I had my drawings with the engineer's stamp on them with me. And I had printouts from the builder's website that showed the certifications. The park knew that what they were getting was a home that was professionally built and safe, which is really what they're looking for. When you get a build CSA certified, at least on a trailer, it goes to this Intertech Canada. That's the organization that actually does the inspections for the certification. And once the build is done and it's been inspected, it goes onto their website. And the park looked to see if the house was there, to make sure that it had the certification and it had been inspected and passed. If you don't want to park in a city, that might not be a big deal for you. But the fact is, every time you decide that you're not going to do something, I'm not going to run the plumbing for a flush toilet because I'm never going to park in a city. I'm not going to use a CSA certified builder because I'm never going to park in municipality. I'm going to use reclaimed materials because it doesn't really matter. I'm not going to be in a city or a town or a municipality that requires, that has safety and building codes that you're going to have to meet. That could be fine. However, down the road, if you change your mind, you now have limited your options substantially. It's always my recommendation to do everything you can to give yourself the most options. So build to the sort of widest set of guidelines, because you then can change your mind down the road. You can change your location, whether you decide to build codes, to use a CSA certified builder, to make sure that your house gets inspected and that it meets all of these safety and building code requirements, or as many of them as you can. That's totally up to you. But just know that down the road, you don't know what you're going to want to do. You don't know where you're going to want to move your tiny house. The reason you're building it on wheels is so that you can move it at some future date. And just give yourself the most options of finding a parking spot. And also keep in mind that finding a parking spot for your tiny house is not the same as being able to live in your tiny house full-time year-round. Again, those are two different things. It's a lot easier to find a spot to park your tiny house if you're not living in it full-time. But if you want to do both, that will make things harder. So you need to do more research and build with more of these things in mind. so that you can go to whatever municipality that you want to park in and say, yes, it doesn't meet traditional building codes, but I've done this, this, and this to prove that this house is professionally built to some set of codes, has been inspected, so that they can be comfortable with approving it. You want to make it easy for them to say yes. That is always going to have to be in your mind. You want to make it easy for these officials to say yes. And some of them don't have a lot of imagination. To be fair, some of them have never encountered anything like this before, and so they are going to default to the answer no if they're not sure, because they don't want to be responsible for approving something that ends up being unsafe and, God forbid, something happens. I hope that was helpful. Again, I cannot give you an answer. I cannot say to you, yes, if you do this, this, and this, you're guaranteed to have a parking spot where you can park your tiny house on wheels and you can live in it year-round without any problems. And the reason I can't is because every place is different. Even in the same province or state, there are going to be differences between towns and cities. So it's tough, but it is doable, and more places are becoming tiny house friendly. Tiny houses on wheels, again, are becoming more and more popular, and there are provinces in Canada that have embraced them much more so than other provinces, such as British Columbia, and Quebec has a number of tiny house villages, which I think is pretty awesome, and you don't really hear a whole lot about. I'd like to get out there and actually tour some of them at some point. I have an announcement about the channel. If you watched my Instagram story, then you already know, but I'm thinking about moving the recipes, cooking videos to a separate channel, because I want to do more in that area, more on cooking, more on veganism and plant-based eating, and also on, sustainability and environmentally friendly products, things like that, and more lifestyle stuff, intentional living, basically. And I think that it kind of belongs in its own channel, because a lot of you guys love the cooking as well as the tiny house stuff, which I think is awesome. But then there are also a lot of you that only come here because of the tiny house information. Also awesome. So I think that maybe if I split them up, that might allow me more leeway in the second channel to just do more lifestyle sort of stuff that doesn't really fit with the tiny house, but I think is fun, I think is interesting, and I think you might like. So I'm going to be doing that. I pretty much decided I'm going to do that. What I don't know is what to call it. And I'm really hoping one of you creative, amazing people can help me think of a name that's clever, because I can't think of anything. I want it to be more than just cooking, but there'll definitely be a lot of food stuff in there, because you know how much I love to cook and eat, actually. So yeah, and this little noodle here will be in both channels. You'll still see Soph. She'll still be the fan favorite in both channels. For those of you worried that it's going to cause me a lot of extra work, it won't. It's the same amount of work. I just upload it in a separate spot. And I just think it might be better for everyone if they're sort of separated. So I'm going to move the recipe videos over there shortly once I figure out what to call this channel. So please help me out with that. And once I've got it set up, I will definitely tell you, and I'll link it in every video that I do, so that you can go over there and see what's happening over on the other channel. And I hope you'll subscribe there too, because I really enjoy doing this sort of stuff. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. If you have any comments about what I've talked about today, please put them down in the comment section. If you have advice for anybody of what has worked for you in your area, that would be awesome. If you found a legal parking spot for your tiny house on wheels that you can live in year-round, I would love for you to share how you did it and where you are, which would be awesome, because if we can share this information, then that means that more of us can make this tiny house dream a reality. And really, that's the goal here, is to let everybody be able to live in the way that makes the most sense for them and makes us all happy. So that's it from Sophie and I will see you next weekend for another tiny house video. I hope you're staying well, and I'll talk to you then.